The photograph is catalogued as ordinary. A street in Seattle dated 1890, labeled simply Front Street after regrade. Brick buildings line both sides. Storefront windows sit strangely low, some half buried, others entirely below the street level. Wooden sidewalks run above first-floor doors. No workers appear, no rubble piles, no active excavation. City records explain it as urban improvement, a necessary raising of streets after flooding and fire. A rational answer. On paper, the contradiction remains. Entire commercial districts appear submerged at once, not under construction but already settled. Windows intact, masonry clean, doors sealed as if buried deliberately. Similar photographs exist in Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, and St. Louis, all dated within a narrow window before 1900. If this were progress, where is the transition? If this were construction, where are the builders? And if this were disaster, why does history remember none of it? What if this photograph is not showing a city being built, but a civilization being covered, then quietly reused? The accepted narrative arrives with the confidence of consensus. By 1870, America surges into its industrial age. Cities grow upward and outward in great lurching expansions. Immigration explains population increases. Fires and floods justify rebuilding. The textbooks teach it simply: young nations become powerful through effort and ingenuity. Photographs from the era show bustling streets in New York and Chicago, horse-drawn traffic, progress frozen in sepia tones, the machinery of civilization humming forward. Yet early city postcards often depict streets already monumental, wide avenues, heavy masonry, ornate facades carved with precision that seems beyond what frontier settlements should reasonably possess. A postcard from Chicago in 1871 shows a city block before the Great Fire. The buildings appear aged and weathered, their architectural complexity suggesting decades or centuries of development. But Chicago was barely 40 years old. The official story claims rapid construction by skilled immigrant labor, ambitious builders, determined municipal planning. The photographs show something else. They show infrastructure that appears inherited rather than erected. Buildings whose foundations seem to predate their recorded construction. Streets laid out with geometric precision that suggests surveying technology beyond the documented capabilities of the era. If these cities were young, why do they already look ancient? Why does every photograph of new construction show workers modifying existing structures rather than building from bare ground? The census records growth. The photographs suggest occupation. Progress is visible, but origins are not. The United States Census becomes authoritative after the Civil War. Numbers climb sharply. Cities explode in size within decades. Between 1870 and 1900, urban populations in America double, then triple. The data appears conclusive. But the handwritten enumeration sheets tell a different story when examined closely. Marginal notes repeat certain phrases: origin unknown, approximate age, estimated residence time. In cities like San Francisco, the 1880 census shows population increases of 40,000 people in a single decade, yet burial records, birth certificates, and housing permits fail to account for such growth. The official explanation remains consistent. Immigration waves from Europe and Asia combined with rural migration to urban centers. Ellis Island processes millions, Angel Island receives thousands. The narrative holds, but immigration records, when cross-referenced with municipal data, reveal gaps. A census enumerator in Boston notes in 1885, many residents claim no memory of arrival and state they have always been here. The note is marked in the margin and never explained. Philadelphia shows similar annotations. So does St. Louis. In Chicago, a census worker records an entire boarding house. 43 residents with identical arrival dates and no documented port of entry. The building itself appears on no construction permit. The residents provide no family names, no birthplaces, no histories before 1871. Statistical analysis reveals the impossibility. The numbers require infrastructure, housing, sanitation, food supply that should have left traces, lumber receipts, brick orders, construction contracts, but municipal archives show gaps, permits for thousands of buildings that appear finished in photographs taken years before the permits were supposedly filed. Growth is recorded, but arrival is blurred. The census shows population. The documents fail to show movement, as if people did not migrate into these cities. They simply appeared, already resident, already integrated, their origins politely left unquestioned. What if populations did not grow through natural increase and immigration, but were inserted into spaces that had been waiting, empty, for them to arrive? The great civic buildings pose their own quiet mystery. By 1890, American cities boast cathedrals, courthouses, and exhibition halls that rival European architecture. Philadelphia City Hall, begun in 1871, features masonry work of staggering masonry complexity. Chicago erects massive stone structures between devastating fires. San Francisco builds elaborate Victorian facades while supposedly still recovering from gold rush tent cities. The construction timelines do not align with photographic evidence. A building dated as completed in 1888 appears weathered and settled in photographs from 1885. Cornerstone dates contradict architectural surveys, but more puzzling than dates are the absences. Where are the construction photographs? For an era obsessed with documenting progress, surprisingly few images show these buildings being erected. No scaffolding phases, no foundation excavations, no worker camps or material staging areas. Photographs show completed structures or ruins, but rarely the transition between them. When construction is documented, it often shows modification rather than creation. Workers removing additions, cleaning facades, lowering floors, as if the buildings existed first and human occupation came after, adapting inherited shells to new purposes. The scale itself suggests impossibility. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, begun in 1858 and completed in 1878, required stone-cutting precision that exceeded documented tooling of the period. The builders supposedly worked without modern cranes, without industrial quarrying, and without mechanized transport. 20 years to complete, yet European cathedrals of similar complexity took centuries. Archives reveal another pattern. Many civic buildings appear on maps before construction permits exist. An 1872 surveyor's map of Denver shows a courthouse that would not officially be commissioned until 1886. A municipal water plan from 1875 in Boston depicts infrastructure around a library whose cornerstone would not be laid until 1880. The buildings exist. Census records confirm their use, but the builders remain vague. Names without biographies, construction companies without business records, architectural firms that vanish from directories after a single project. What if these structures were inherited, not erected? What if American cities did not build their monuments, but cleaned them, repaired them, and claimed them as new? The photographs should be crowded. American cities in the 1880s supposedly teemed with life. Immigrants, workers, merchants, children. Population density in Manhattan reached levels that would not be matched again until the 20th century. Yet many photographs from the era show the opposite. Entire city blocks stand empty. Wide boulevards stretch without a single pedestrian. Commercial districts appear abandoned. The official explanation was that long exposure times were required by early photography technology. Cameras could not capture moving subjects, so streets appear depopulated. But the explanation fails on inspection. In photograph after photograph, flags hang still. Horses stand frozen mid-stride, suggesting a short exposure. Shadows indicate a brief capture time. Window curtains show no motion blur. These are not long exposures that washed away crowds. These are empty streets, accurately photographed. A series from Paris, dated 1878, shows the boulevards near the Opera completely vacant despite being taken on a documented market day. San Francisco's Market Street, photographed in 1886, reveals blocks of storefronts with no customers, no vendors, no activity. Boston's waterfront, captured in multiple images between 1880 and 1890, shows dozens of buildings but almost no human presence. When people do appear, they often seem posed, standing in doorways, arranged in small groups, as if placed deliberately rather than caught candidly. The spontaneous chaos of urban life is absent. The streets feel staged. Municipal records from the same years describe overcrowding, density, congestion. But the photographs suggest something else. They suggest cities built for populations that had not yet arrived, infrastructure waiting to be inhabited, streets prepared for crowds that would only materialize later. These streets were not caught between moments. They appear unused, maintained, but vacant, as if photographed during a pause between one civilization departing and another arriving. A city without people is not under construction. It is waiting. And the question remains, waiting for whom? Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were relocated across North America through the Orphan train movement. The system operated with startling efficiency. Children were collected from eastern cities, transported westward, and distributed to families who needed farm labor or household help. The intake records reveal the pattern. At New York's Foundling Hospital, admission logs repeat the same phrases. Parents unknown. Origin not stated. No family history. Not occasionally, but consistently, across thousands of entries. The Children's Aid Society processed entire groups with identical documentation gaps. The word unknown appears again and again. Official history explains this as the consequence of poverty, disease, and immigration chaos. Urban squalor produced orphans faster than systems could track them, but the scale of it defies that explanation. By 1880, foundling hospitals in New York alone were receiving over 100 children per week, far exceeding the city's documented mortality rates. Death records do not account for the numbers. Immigration logs fail to show corresponding family arrivals. Birth certificates for these children often do not exist, yet they appear healthy, clothed, old enough to travel, speaking English or adaptable to it without documented origins. An intake worker at the Foundling Hospital wrote in 1882 that another 30 arrived that day. They were asked the usual questions and had no answers. It was as though they materialized. The note was filed, unremarked upon. The distribution system itself suggests preparation. Western families and communities were ready to absorb these children, housing arranged, work assigned, documentation processed, as if the infrastructure for repopulation had been established before the children arrived. Genealogical research in the 21st century reveals the consequence. Millions of Americans cannot trace ancestry beyond these orphan-trained children. Family trees terminate in the 1880s with a child whose birthplace is listed as unknown, whose parents are listed as deceased, whose history begins midstream. The missing link is lost to ancestry. These children came from somewhere, yet nowhere is recorded. They form a population without memory, inserted into a society that asked few questions. Orphans without origins become adults without ancestry, and their descendants inherit the gap. What if the Orphan explosion was not a crisis response but a repopulation program? In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition. Within months, an entire city arose on reclaimed marshland along Lake Michigan. Over 200 buildings, 14 million square feet of exhibition space, electric lighting throughout, running water, rail systems, ornamental plaster facades detailed to look like marble. Officially, it was temporary. Known as the White City, designed to last a season, then be demolished, but the construction defied that premise. Buildings featured stone foundations, integrated plumbing, electrical infrastructure that required permanent installation. The Court of Honor alone covered acres with structures that appeared classical, aged, monumental, and intended to endure. Photographs from the construction phase are curiously scarce. When they exist, they show workers modifying and cleaning rather than building from nothing. Official timelines claim 2 years of construction, yet photographs from 1891 show many buildings substantially complete before major work supposedly began. After the fair closed, nearly everything was demolished, systematically, thoroughly. The official reason was that the structures were too fragile to maintain, built from temporary materials. But photographs show solid construction. Demolition crews used explosives and heavy equipment, methods unnecessary for plaster and wood. The same pattern repeats at other world fairs. Philadelphia in 1876, Paris in 1889, St. Louis in 1904. Massive architectural achievements, erected impossibly fast, then destroyed completely. The exhibitions showcased what civilization could build, then erased it. Contemporary observers noted the strangeness. An architect visiting the Chicago Fair wrote that these buildings appeared ancient, not new, as if we were displaying ruins rather than construction. His comment was published in a trade journal, then largely forgotten. What if the fairs were not exhibitions of future possibility, but revelations of inherited capability? What if they displayed architecture that already existed, cleaned and repurposed for public viewing, then dismantled to preserve the narrative of gradual progress? The Chicago Fairgrounds became Jackson Park. Scattered remnants remain, a single building and foundation traces. But the photographs preserve what was destroyed. And the photographs show buildings too sophisticated, too detailed, too complete to have been temporary constructions. They show structures meant to last. The fairs drew millions of visitors who walked through cities that should not have been possible. Then the cities vanished. And history recorded it as ambitious showmanship, nothing more. Beneath modern cities, a pattern emerges during renovation and excavation. Workers breaking ground for new construction discover windows, ornate, intact, designed to illuminate rooms that now sit entirely underground. Doors that lead nowhere, carved stone facades buried beneath street level. The explanation appears in city planning documents across continents: street raising. After fires, floods, or for sanitation improvements, cities supposedly raised their street levels, burying first floors and creating new ground levels above the old. Seattle provides the most documented example, with entire districts submerged beneath raised streets in the 1890s. But Seattle is not unique. Chicago raised its streets in the 1850s. Boston did the same. Edinburgh's Mary King's Close sits buried beneath the modern city. Parts of Rome rest on layers of previous construction. The pattern is global, and the timing is clustered around the mid to late 19th century. The official narrative treats these as independent decisions by separate cities facing local challenges. But the synchronicity suggests something else. Why would cities worldwide facing different circumstances choose the same solution in the same narrow time frame? The buried levels reveal additional mysteries. They are not crude foundations or rough spaces. They are finished rooms with decorative elements, proper windows, and sophisticated masonry. Spaces designed for occupation, not as substructures, as if they were the original ground floor and something caused them to be buried rather than abandoned. Photographs of excavated spaces show sediment layers, fine, compacted earth, separating the buried levels from the raised streets. These are not rubble from demolition, they are not ash from fire. The deposits are uniform and they suggest flooding or slow burial rather than deliberate filling. In Seattle, the underground tours showcase this strangeness. Tourists walk through 19th century storefronts now beneath modern streets. The spaces are intact. Too intact. If these were simply buried for convenience, why preserve them so carefully? Why not demolish and rebuild? The pattern suggests an alternative sequence. The buried levels came first, already built. An event, flood, mudslide, or something less documented, partially buried them. Rather than excavate, cities built upward, creating new street levels and leaving the old buried but intact. Streets rise when something beneath must be hidden or when something above must be explained without acknowledging what came before. The architectural similarities span continents. Neoclassical domes in Washington mirror those in St. Petersburg. Railway stations in London, Paris, and New York share design elements beyond mere Victorian fashion. Government buildings from Delhi to Buenos Aires repeat patterns that suggest common templates, not independent innovation. The timing compounds the mystery. Between 1850 and 1900, cities worldwide underwent similar transformations. Urban planning emerged with startling consistency. Gaslighting, sewage systems, grid street layouts, parks following specific design principles, and building codes produced similar results despite different contexts. Official history attributes this to industrial standardization and global communication. Architects studied abroad, books circulated, and the telegraph enabled rapid information exchange. Nations modernized by copying successful models, but the speed suggests something beyond gradual diffusion. Entire cities adopted systems simultaneously, not over decades, but within years. Infrastructure appeared coordinated, as if rolled out according to a shared plan, rather than developed independently. A study of municipal water systems reveals the pattern most clearly. Between 1870 and 1890, over 50 major cities installed complex underground pipe networks. The engineering required sophisticated surveying, metallurgy, and hydraulic knowledge. Yet cities with different governments, resources, and expertise completed similar systems in overlapping timeframes. The same occurs with electrification. By 1900, cities worldwide featured electric streetlights using comparable technology and similar distribution patterns. The official story credits rapid innovation and industrial competition. But the documentation shows gaps, with patents filed after systems were already operational and construction records missing for infrastructure that clearly exists. Civilizations usually diverge, local conditions create unique solutions, cultural differences produce architectural variation. But the late 19th century shows convergence instead, global similarity that suggests either unprecedented coordination or shared inheritance. Parallel rebuilding of this scale across continents in an era before modern global governance implies either coordination or the restoration of something that existed before the nations themselves emerged. The buildings remain, the systems function, but their origins blur into accepted narratives that stress independence and innovation, even as the evidence suggests synchronicity and implementation rather than invention. This one appears reset. Resets require planning. The sediment does not behave like construction debris. When cities excavate beneath modern street levels, they encounter layers of compacted earth, fine particles uniformly distributed, sometimes several feet thick. It appears between buried structures and raised streets, as if it arrived naturally rather than through human dumping. Flood reports from the mid-19th century describe unusual deposits. An 1862 report from California's Central Valley mentions mud flows of unknown origin extending miles beyond flood zones. Missouri records from 1844 describe the Mississippi River Valley covered in brown sediment without corresponding precipitation. Similar reports appear across continents, mud arriving without adequate rain, deposits exceeding flood capacity, sediment behaving more like slow accumulation than sudden disaster. The pattern suggests inundation rather than construction. Traditional explanations treat buried city levels as deliberate engineering, streets raised purposefully, old levels filled intentionally. But the sediment layers tell a different story. They suggest burial by external force, not internal choice. Geological surveys map these layers inconsistently. Some dismiss them as construction fill. Others note their uniform composition across different cities, similar particle size, similar mineral content despite geographic separation. The layers share characteristics with loess deposits or volcanic ash, but without corresponding volcanic activity or wind patterns that would explain global distribution. Photographs of excavated spaces show the sediment's placement. It sits atop buried structures, filling spaces up to window level, then stopping, as if a waterline marked a high point and then receded. Above the sediment line, cities built upward. Below it, older structures remain, preserved by the very burial that ended their original use. Official reports avoid speculation about origins. The sediment exists. Its placement is documented, but explanations remain vague, described as accumulated fill, urban waste, or construction material. The specificity of its distribution goes unremarked. Mud behaves differently than collapse. Collapse creates rubble piles, uneven destruction. Mud deposits evenly, preserves structures, fills rather than breaks. The buried levels beneath cities worldwide show preservation, not destruction, as if something covered them gently, then left them intact for later discovery. What buries without breaking? What covers entire cities uniformly, globally, within a narrow time frame, leaving structures intact but unusable until someone decides to build on top rather than excavate below? The census surges align with orphan distributions. From 1870 to 1900, cities showing the sharpest population increases also received the largest orphan train allocations. Chicago's population doubles between 1880 and 1890, and it receives 40,000 orphan placements. St. Louis shows a 50% increase and absorbs 30,000 children. The pattern repeats across regions. The children were placed into specific locations, farms, small towns, developing territories, areas with infrastructure but insufficient population, spaces that appeared prepared for inhabitants. Distribution maps show intentionality, children sent where labor was needed, where communities could absorb them, where questions about origins would be fewer. By 1900, the orphan trained children had become adults. They married, produced families, and integrated into communities that had no memory of life before their arrival. Their children, the next generation, inherited no stories of migration, no tales of old countries, no genealogies extending beyond a single generation. Census records from 1920 show the consequence. Millions of Americans list birthplaces as unknown or orphanage. Family trees terminate. Ancestry becomes speculation. The population appears, functions, reproduces, but cannot trace backward beyond a certain point. The system required infrastructure that predated the need. Orphanages stood ready to process thousands. Rail systems were capable of mass transport. Western communities prepared to receive children they had not requested. Documentation systems recorded placement but erased origin. Official history frames this as a charitable response to urban poverty. But the scale and coordination suggest planning. Children appeared in numbers that exceeded documented urban mortality. They were distributed with an efficiency that implies preparation. And they filled spaces that seemed to be waiting. A reset requires infrastructure and inhabitants. Empty cities need populations. Buried levels require people willing to build above them without asking what lies below. Orphans without origins become adults without questions, and their descendants inherit a history that begins mid-sentence. What if the orphan explosion was not crisis management but the repopulation of a civilization that had paused? What if these children did not come from nowhere, but were the transition population, the bridge between what was and what would be? The census records growth. The orphan trains provided the people, and together they created a population whose collective memory begins precisely when the official narrative says the modern era started. History resumed, but something had ended first. The textbooks arrive with remarkable consistency. By 1900, American public schools had adopted standardized history curricula. The narrative is clean: discovery, colonization, revolution, expansion, industrialization. Events proceed linearly, progress is inevitable, the past is settled. Earlier educational materials show more variety. School primers from the 1840s contain regional histories, local legends, references to structures whose origins were uncertain. But after the 1880s, textbooks streamline. The complexity vanishes. The narrative consolidates. A comparison of history textbooks from 1870 and 1900 reveals what disappeared. Earlier books acknowledge architectural mysteries, ancient earthworks whose builders were unknown, stone structures without attribution, infrastructure predating colonial records. Later editions either omit these references or attribute them to primitive peoples or early settlers without elaboration. The standardization extends beyond schools. Exhibitions at world fairs tell coordinated stories. Museums arrange collections to support specific timelines. Monuments commemorate events whose documentation is surprisingly thin. The past becomes what institutions say it was, and what institutions say is remarkably uniform. This is not suppression through violence, it is simplification through education. Each generation learns a cleaner version than the last. Anomalies become footnotes, then disappear entirely. Within 2 generations, the streamlined narrative becomes the only narrative most people know. Photographs that do not fit the story remain in archives, but lose context. The Seattle Underground becomes a tourist curiosity, not evidence. The orphan trains become a humanitarian tale, not a demographic mystery. Empty streets in photographs become a technical artifact, not documentation. Memory does not need to be erased forcibly when it can be replaced educationally. Teach children a consistent story. Remove contradictory evidence from active circulation. Wait for the older generation to die. Within 50 years, the new narrative is simply history. Civic myths emerge with suspicious polish. Every city has its founding story, its great fire, its rebuilding tale. The stories share structure, disaster, resilience, renewal, regardless of local conditions. As if the template for explaining the current state was distributed along with the infrastructure itself. History written after catastrophe reads differently than history written during continuity. It emphasizes beginnings over transitions. It celebrates building over inheriting. It treats the present as achievement rather than occupation. And the generation that lives it, that rebuilds or repopulates or simply arrives, becomes the official start of the timeline, whether they built it or simply moved in. In the age of digital genealogy, millions attempt to trace their ancestry. They search census records, immigration logs, church registries, municipal documents, and millions discover the same terminus point, the 1880s. Family trees grow backward through the 20th century, then hit an absence. A grandparent whose parents are listed as unknown. An ancestor marked orphan with no origin. A branch that ends at a census entry with no prior record. The pattern is so common it has become normalized. Genealogical dead ends in the late 19th century are treated as inevitable, a limitation of historical record-keeping. But the scale is unprecedented. Before the 1880s, genealogical research often traces families for centuries. Parish records in Europe extend back through the Renaissance, church baptisms, marriage licenses, property deeds. The documentation exists. Then, for a massive portion of the population, the chain breaks. Not gradually, but abruptly, clustering around a specific period. Records stop in large numbers. The official explanation cites immigration chaos, urbanization, and incomplete record-keeping. And for some people this holds, but for others the absence is different. It is not that records were lost, it is that they never existed. These individuals appear in the system fully formed, adults or children, already integrated, with no prior documentation. Never is perhaps the most troubling possibility. DNA testing in recent years has added another layer of mystery. Some testers discover ancestry compositions that do not align with family stories. Unexpected geographic origins, genetic markers from regions their families never mentioned. As if the past was simplified in the telling, smoothed into acceptable narratives that hid complexity. An inheritance without ancestry is still an inheritance. The people who could not trace their families still lived, worked, built, and passed down what they had. The cities functioned regardless of whether their inhabitants could name their great-grandparents. Civilization continued. Inheritance persisted. But the question persists. Who lived in these cities before the names resumed? Who occupied the structures before the census enumerated them? Who walked the streets before the photographs showed crowds? The infrastructure suggests previous occupants. The buried levels suggest previous use. The architectural sophistication suggests previous civilization. But the people, their names, their stories, their records, are absent. As if a curtain fell, and when it rose again, a new cast was performing on an inherited stage. A photograph is catalogued as ordinary. Front Street in Seattle, 1890. Buried storefronts, raised sidewalks, windows below street level. Seattle above an older street. The street is no longer empty. Modern Seattle thrives above it. Tourists visit the underground. The city functions, oblivious to the questions the photograph raises. Official history explains it. Textbooks teach it. The narrative holds, but the lower windows remain sealed. Between the archival image and the present day lie questions that an accumulation of evidence makes harder to dismiss. Census surges occur without documented arrivals. Orphan trains appear with no recorded origins. Buried cities lack adequate disaster records. Architecture exists without documented builders. A global synchronicity appears without explained coordination. Empty streets remain without explanation. Sediment deposits remain without identified source. Each element, isolated, permits conventional interpretation. Immigration was poorly documented. Fires destroyed records. Progress was rapid. Photography was imperfect. Cities made independent, similar decisions. But together the pattern suggests a different story. It suggests a civilization that paused, was buried or abandoned, then reoccupied and renamed. It suggests cities built by someone, for someone, then inherited by populations who arrived with simplified histories and few questions. It suggests a reset, partial, coordinated, global, that left infrastructure intact while erasing memory. The evidence does not demand belief. It invites investigation. It offers pattern recognition to anyone willing to look past the official narrative and examine what the photographs, census records, and buried structures actually show. History says nothing happened here. A city grew, burned, rebuilt, progressed, normal urban development across decades of industrialization. The ground disagrees. Beneath the modern streets lie windows that were meant to be seen, doors that were meant to be opened, rooms that were designed for life that now exist only in darkness. Were we built from the past or placed upon it? Did we inherit these cities, or did we simply forget who built them first? The photograph offers no answer, only evidence, and the question remains,